Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Today we're going to be talking about the question of where blockchain can revolutionize payments. And I think, in some ways that was a question for 10 years ago or so, but I think it behooves us to keep asking it because there's been some developments over the past year or so that I think make that question relevant as people are continuing to develop payment systems based on blockchain. And I think, it's always worth continuing to ask whether blockchain is the best way of producing superior security, finality, efficiency in a way that you can't replicate more efficiently in a centralized environment. So I'm delighted to be joined on the stage today. I've got Scott Hendry here, who's the Senior Special Director in Financial Technology for the Bank of Canada. David Creer, Global Digital Assets and CBDC Lead at GFT Group. And I believe, yes, we've got Christian Catalini on the screen there. Is the founder of the MIT Crypto Economics Lab and a research scientist at the MIT Sloan School. So thank you for joining me, everyone. Sadly, we were going to be joined today by Knut Sandal from the Norges Bank, but he is ill and sends his apologies. So we wish him all the best. Just before we kick off, to get the audience's views on this topic, we've got a poll question on Swapcard. How important will blockchain be to our payments ecosystem in 10 years? So there's a range of options there, and we'll reveal your thoughts at the end, and maybe they'll develop over the course of the panel. So to start off, I mentioned that there'd been a couple of big changes in the past year or so that maybe change how we look at blockchain and its role in payments. And obviously, in the context of the crypto winter, there's a question about whether the blockchain movement has, in a sense, been exposed, or there's a sense that what's happened to the asset prices show that it's maybe not quite as valuable as it first seemed, and maybe we need to reassess its role there. Christian, can I come to you on that? Maybe you could give your thoughts on how the crypto winter has maybe changed our view of where blockchain fits into payments.
Yes, I think it's important to keep into consideration why we got here. To some extent, some of the incentives inherent in how cryptocurrencies kind of have developed over the last few years are also what drove the massive waves of speculation and hype. Many founders have been distracted by some of these prices and kind of are taking these prices at face value as a measure to actual utility being created for consumers, for businesses, and for other participants. So I think what we've seen is actually the space really take a step back and start focusing a lot more on fundamentals. There's a lot more focus on the leading networks rather than a long tail of new protocols that are being launched. And I think there's also more attention to better metrics. Again, price and market cap not only were easy to manipulate, as we've seen probably in some of the more egregious forms of fraud, but we're also not indicative of any actual progress in terms of solving problems. So although you may look at crypto winter and say, well, the technology is kind of done, it's important to remember that this is a general purpose technology, very much like the internet. These technologies take decades to travel through society and really incorporate all the changes that we need for them to succeed. The hard part of a blockchain ecosystem, especially when it comes to payments, is not the blockchain itself. It's not the technology. It's everything that you do at the edges. ML, CFT, identity, these are much harder problems to solve. They're slowly being solved. And so I'm actually still quite optimistic. I think the difference is that, again, it's going to take longer than people have expected. And it's going to require efforts on the edges to really make the technology useful. In and of itself, a ledger is just a piece of software. And so as society, as the right regulatory frameworks and the right missing pieces, I think we'll definitely see payments run on rails that are going to be more open and interoperable.
Maybe if I might add something there for discussion, if that's okay. I think we also need to separate the technology of blockchain itself from the public networks and the price of particular digital assets. A lot of the payments networks that we're working on and have been working on for the past 7 or 8 years haven't been related to the public networks will never be related to the public networks, because that's, at this point in time, it's not, you can't really regulate that. So I think during the crypto winter, there was a lot of speculation about how crypto and blockchain is going in one direction, and the price of coins and certain exchanges having issues and all of this kind of stuff. That doesn't necessarily affect payments directly, because we're using the technology, we're using the underlying ledger, as Christian said, right? So I think we need to make the differentiation between those two things.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good points, both of you. Thank you. It's maybe worth also talking a little bit about the direction of travel in research and experimentation, though. I mean, we've just heard from Mu Changchun from the People's Bank of China, who has a central bank digital currency not built on blockchain, and they're not alone. There's certainly other people pursuing that direction. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, Scott. Where do you feel like, given the direction of research, are you expecting us to move? Are you expecting to see central banks move further away from blockchain or back towards it, or where do you see that going?
I think we're still trying to sort a lot of that out. Well, like we've alluded to in these two answers and then in the previous presentation, it's really going to depend on the context. And we need to think seriously about when blockchain is really useful. And I think Changchun really covered it there, that it's useful when there's a lack of trust. That's where it grew up, and that's where its real raison d'etre is when you think about use cases for it. That if there is a lack of trust between the principal parties, and there doesn't seem to be any other way to get them together, then maybe blockchain can help do that. And there have been circumstances in which that has really shown there is some payoff. And I think we need to think more seriously about that. I think the industry is still struggling with that. There's been some that have grown up and they seem to be gaining some attraction, but there's still a long way to go. And I think we still need more experimentation and more openness to the possibility. But in a sense, there's too much experimentation because we're trying it everywhere. And in many cases, it's just not obvious that it's needed there.
I suppose it does make sense to try it everywhere, but then maybe narrow down, I suppose. Have you got any thoughts on that? I mean, Mu Changchun did mention, from their perspective, trust isn't an issue for them because they feel as a central bank they are a trusted party, but obviously not everyone is gonna feel that way. Have you any thoughts on where they fit in?
Yeah, so I think to a certain extent, even if you're not using blockchain, you are most undoubtedly in the CBDC world and payments world, you're using cryptography. Yeah. And you want to be able to sign your transactions to be able to give some kind of proof of the transaction, who emitted that transaction, and whether who has provenance along the payment chain, right? Whether you really want to have a distributed ledger where everybody has to have, you have all the FSIs, each of them has a node, et cetera, really depends on what you're trying to make payment for, and whether, as you said quite rightly, whether you need that trust of that stability within the network, where if one of these network participants is not there, then you need to have a record of the ledger outside of that. And the more trust you would need, arguably, the more resilient you would need it to be. So it'd be kind of pushing towards public infrastructure. And there's some quite interesting things now with ZK rollups, where you have private-public infrastructure options as well, where you work on private and then roll it up in a private way to the public networks. But broadly, I would say that cryptography, for sure, I think helps in the majority of situations. I think blockchain and distributed ledger needs to be thought about before it's implemented. And when you do that and you do it well, then it makes sense. But there's a cost to that in terms of maintenance, in terms of design, in terms of upgrading, right?
Yeah. Sorry, you mentioned, just to go back a moment, you mentioned, in some cases it's useful and in other cases it's probably not. Can you go into a little bit more depth on, what characterizes a case where the blockchain-based architecture is more appropriate?
Yeah, sure. So I would say that in in the case of payments, I mean, it really depends on whether you're doing a kind of, bilateral payment between two parties, whether you have more than two parties involved. I think it also depends really on the way that people are, the amount that people are moving as well. So if you're paying, $3 for, I don't know, something at the supermarket, that's very different from making a transaction of, $20,000, right? As an example. So we always had the rule of thumb that if you're trying to move or making a transaction of high value, so between various different network participants, you undoubtedly have some lack of trust there, regardless of the fact of whether actually these network participants work together all the time. There is this thing of, well, if things don't work, who's responsible, right? And in those cases, I think then it fits. If you have just a bilateral transaction for something that's not really worth a huge amount of value, then
maybe not.
It's maybe a little bit overkill.
So more complex and high value transactions. Christian, do you agree with that? I mean, one thing that's interesting to me is that when people talk about stable coins and so on, often one of the things that they are seeing as a potential use case for it is online micropayments and so on, and reducing the cost of payments versus traditional payment rails. So I'm just wondering where you feel like where you stand on what David was saying, I guess.
Yeah, so I mean, as a first point, I feel like we always try to compare public sector infrastructure and efforts to cryptocurrency network or private efforts in this space. I think there's strong complements, and there's often a desire to make them compete, whereas I think in the end, we will see both develop and flourish for different use cases, for different applications. There's also different comparative advantages. So I do think that the speed at which open interoperable protocols that support payments are evolving today, the ones that we see again on cryptocurrency networks, is way, way faster than anything else that we will see for good reasons. On the public sector side, again, different tools for different tasks. But it is true that from an economics perspective, when I look at market structure and when I look at, over decades, again, what the internet did to a number of sectors of the economy, bringing new forms of competition, is exactly what we're going to see unfold on cryptocurrency networks. The power of a protocol that is coded in software that everybody can build on, everybody can recombine functionality on, is just something that we haven't experienced in the financial system. And of course, I mean, it presents a lot of challenges, and we haven't seen yet massive adoption because those challenges are not fully solved. But once they're solved and once there's progress on those, I think we're just going to look back and kind of all of this will be somewhat mute. Today, a lot of traffic moves on the internet in many different ways, public application, private applications. Nobody even thinks about TCP/IP. I think there's a strong case that some of these networks, especially the ones that have a longer track record in terms of security, governance, and everything else, will really emerge as just generalized infrastructure. People will use them in all sort of ways. Eventually, I wouldn't be surprised if you'd see a CBDC token on one of these networks. Again, it's not going to happen right away, but I think as we develop the space, you will see that it is a technology that is very much general purpose, and so payments are a natural fit for something that's a lot more interoperable and open.
Yeah, absolutely.
The one thing I wanted to add to that is there's always a lack of trust in payments. One side always doesn't trust the other side. But for that small transaction, that might not be the deciding factor in designing the system to settle the payment. The speed is the deciding factor there. You need something that goes fast because people are impatient when they're buying their morning coffee or whatever else they're trying to do for that small dollar value. So design for the use case and the principal challenge involved in that use case is really what it comes down to. And some use cases, the lack of trust is more important, and a blockchain could be more of a solution. In other use cases, getting something that's fast and reliable and always secure is the deciding factor.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, speed is a really interesting question because I think, I mean, as we heard Mu Changchun saying, when they've got very high concurrence needs, blockchain isn't suitable for that. You know, scalability was always a concern early in the days of blockchain. I think we've come a long way on that point, but is there, you know, do we hit an upper ceiling that the PBOC seems to have found where, you know, if you're looking for the speed that Scott is talking about, or is this something we can innovate around, or is that likely to remain a ceiling? Or either of you?
So I think that we have to remember that blockchain technology in itself uses underlying cryptographic methods and also has to distribute that across a network and have consensus during that process. That's not a straightforward, simple thing that you can do. There's obviously different types of consensus methods. There's different types of cryptography. There's sharding. There's all sorts of things. I think that most of the time you are dealing with. So we you know, at GFT we're doing a thing called the Universal Digital Payments Network, which we launched earlier in Davos, and that's a payment network to be able to connect CBDCs in the future and stable coins at this point in time, right? And when we're using Hyperledger Besu for that, and in terms of scale, we were looking at the amount of transactions per second that Hyperledger Besu is able to scale, and really whether that fits into a kind of, you know, global payments network. And then we've kind of worked back from what Swift is doing, you know, per day, and then worked downwards. And actually, the transactions per second that you could get from a private permissioned ledger at this point in time, if you set it up correctly with, you know, under 24, 25 validator nodes, is actually more or less at the kind of same kind of models of what, you know, Swift has on their daily record. So actually, when you bring it down to, you know, transactions per second and then back up to a billions per day kind of level, then I think it's not such a big issue. Obviously, if you had to do all of the fiat transactions and CBDC transactions and stablecoin transactions for the whole of the world, then that's a completely different kettle of fish. But I don't think anybody's trying to do that. Yeah,
yeah. So we've hit a stage where the performance in terms of transactions per second is going to be suitable for some quite high throughput use cases.
Depending on the technology and depending on how you implement it.
Yeah.
Especially the second part. The second part's really important.
Right.
I may even go further. I would actually say that, look, as some of you may remember, right, we built our own layer 1 high performance new programming language and everything as part of the Libra DM effort. And those were somewhat the incentives also in the space. We've seen a proliferation of these new high performance layer 1s. The challenge with that is that to some extent, when you introduce new validators, you have a different trust model back into the picture. My guess, seeing everything that has happened, especially last year, is that the way to scaling is actually to scale the core blockchain networks that we have out today, the public permissionless ones. There are solutions, you know, L2 scaling solutions, both for Bitcoin and Ethereum. I think they will support, you know, millions of transactions per second, mostly because not all of those transactions will be, you know, point to point. They will be going through major hubs and major intermediaries that will come onto these networks. So I think the scaling problem is solved. Moreover, it's solved on the public networks. So I think what we will see, and again, it's early days, we will see these core public networks scale, the cryptocurrency-based ones, and I think people will really be surprised to some extent by how quickly progress has been made. You know, while there was a lot of noise and speculation, I think people have been building some pretty amazing technology on these networks.
Yeah, one other thing you have to keep in mind is other requirements on the system when you're looking at the scalability. And in our experimentation, one thing we're finding is that if you want to do anything, include any of the more privacy-enhancing techniques, then the scalability of the system really comes down. In many cases, to the point of making it non-viable for something you want to do relatively quickly, which wouldn't be fine or wouldn't be a problem for an asset transaction where it's millions of dollars, you're willing to wait a little while to get privacy if that's what you want. But again, if you want a fast transaction or even reasonably fast, but you want privacy, they're incompatible. So we have to have some other solution. I don't know that we're there yet, but.
Yeah. It's an interesting one. It does seem like it's not quite settled. I wanted to come back to what Christian was saying about the public permissionless networks of the sort that we see cryptocurrencies based on, and private permission networks that have become more well used in financial services. And just from my own, when I started talking to banks about this sort of technology in 2017, 2018. Back then, they were only really considering permission networks. There was no confidence that public networks could provide enough security and stability and privacy. And I think, over the past few years, people have come to realize that you can get more privacy and more stability and scalability with public networks than they previously thought. But again, I'm not sure where we run into a ceiling on that. So do you have any thoughts on the public and private? Where might both be? Again, maybe like Christian was saying, this is the sort of thing where it's not necessarily going to be a winner-takes-all thing. There might be multiple use cases for each, but yeah, if you've got any thoughts on where they fit.
Yeah, so I think that we're still in the stage where a lot of infrastructure from financial services institutions is being built on private, though there is some experimentation about taking some things to production on public. That's kind of where we are at the moment. The reason for that is generally around regulation in the secondary market. So this is a little bit outside of payments, but how are you going to be able to do KYC on the secondary market in the public space where anybody can send a digital asset between one wallet and another? Whereas if you have a private situation, then you can very much control KYC, AML, all of these kinds of things yourself. I think in terms of technology as well, I think they're both advancing very quickly. There's a lot of interlinks as well now between private and public that there didn't used to be in the past. So you have, technologies such as Cardano or Avalanche that use like side chains, for example. You have ZK rollups, which I explained before, which mean that you can have a private permission blockchain and then use a ZK rollup to be able to make a testament onto a public blockchain without giving any information about what you're doing in the private blockchain, but mathematically you can prove that it's connected to the two. So these things weren't around maybe 5-10 years ago, right? And because they weren't around, people were well, maybe some people were testing them, but people weren't implementing with them. So I think in some cases the technology will lead the implementation. In other cases, the implementation will kind of, lead the technology, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, just to add to that a bit, I think this interoperability or interlinking question is very fundamental because, as was mentioned, we're not going to have one ledger for everything. That might make sense for a utopia, but we don't live there. So we live in the real world, and as we just said, the blockchain isn't for everything. And I'm not convinced it would be for core settlement of a CBDC, but there's a lot of other use cases out there that it could make sense for, and I want to support growth and development in the financial sector and innovation. So how can one system that's not blockchain-based support the development of other activity that is blockchain-based? We need to make sure that money can flow, that assets can be exchanged, that interoperability is core to all of this. It gets the settlement to the real asset or the financial asset side, and it's just everything about it.
Yeah. I mean, I think the interoperability question, I mean, there's a lot of legal and regulatory questions, but that seems to be, when you look at interoperability bridges, when you see a cryptocurrency hack or a theft, it's usually in a bridge at the moment. It does seem like there are some technical challenges still remaining to be solved there. Or, I mean, possibly, there are good technical answers to that, but they haven't been fully rolled out sufficiently effectively yet. But it's going to be a complicated challenge, and I'm wondering if it's probably not a challenge unique to blockchain, but is there a way, would a centralized architecture get you around some of that? Does it make that kind of thing simpler if you're dealing with interoperability, or do you just run into the same sorts of challenges there? Maybe one for Christian?
Yes, maybe let me first briefly address the privacy issue. Again, I think privacy is something that on layer 2 scaling solutions such as Lightning is a solved problem, because essentially you're making only privy to a transaction to people that should be, very much like in the traditional system. But when it comes to interoperability, I think that's another major driving force that will bring more application on the major public chains. It's the same reason why we don't have two versions of TCP/IP. At the end, the standardization force of hundreds of thousands of developers and projects building on the same network is going to kind of countervail some of the trade-offs, and you'll see a lot more convergence. So this is kind of traditional in any new industry. You see massive entry, many new projects. Think about the early days of the automobile industry, and then there's a major shakeout. I think that's what we're seeing right now on layer 1 networks. Many tried new models, and I think actually the activity will converge because of interoperability on one or two networks. I think what's interesting there for the public sector is that doesn't mean that public sector infrastructure won't play a major role. And if and when there's value in connecting this two, of course, if you have a network that has a higher degree of trust, that network can always bridge to one with a lesser degree of trust. It's the other way around, in a safe way, that it's a lot more problematic. And so all the problems you've seen with bridges today is that people are taking shortcuts. People are creating wrapped assets where essentially you feel like you're owning the underlying asset, but you're really not. So until we get to a point where interoperability is trustless, and that's a very hard problem to solve, I don't think you'll see bridges really excel and succeed, because they're really fragile. And if anything, often consumers or users will feel like they're owning one asset, where really they're owning kind of a derivative claim on that, both from a legal perspective, but also more from a security perspective.
Maybe just from a security perspective as well. I mean, we have to remember that a lot of the blockchain frameworks and the solutions and the networks have very different underlying approach in terms of the way that they work. And a lot of the new solutions also have a very different underlying approach in terms of the technology that they use. So it's unlike, for example, AI or big data or cloud or anything like that, where things, yes, you might have different products, but they use similar technologies, right? Actually, it's very different, one blockchain technology to another, and therefore when you try and connect these things, you do things like wrapping digital assets or providing, let's say, new innovative tools on top of them, you have an added challenge of being able to connect things which are not necessarily using the same underlying technologies, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess we can hope for Christian to be right about convergence on 1 to 2 protocols, because without that, I think it remains a big challenge. One thing that I wanted to come back to that you mentioned, you were saying it was less about payments, for securities, regulating the secondary market and making sure you know the counterparty to a transaction. It certainly does apply in payments, right? Like if I issue a stable coin and I KYC Scott, but I don't KYC you, and he pays you, and then you buy drugs or something bad, as an issuer, I might be running into accountability problems, and just because of fundamentally the peer-to-peer nature of the settlement, I feel like that's going to be a problem for a lot of blockchain-based payment systems unless it's private, I suppose is the way around that. But Christian, do you have any thoughts on I guess what kind of problems that brings up, and what solutions there might be?
I think that's exactly the hard part of the problem. Again, using a distributed ledger and representing a token that is supposed to track $1 on it, it's not that hard. Of course, if you want to ensure that token tracks the dollar, actually never depegs, and is actually a representation of a direct claim against the reserve assets, things get a lot more complicated. And there's definitely a lot of work to be done to make stablecoins safe and sound and secure, and something that we can use at scale. But the hardest problem is, KYC, AML, CFT. How do we ensure that on an open network, we can still replicate all the guarantees that we come to expect from traditional payment systems? That's much more complicated. It's the messy interface between the real world with people and identity and kind of their digital representations. I think we need those innovations in that space, better identity, before we can really use these networks to their full potential. Otherwise, we're of course going to be fostering networks that will not be safe, that will facilitate financial crime, and I don't see that kind of happening at any scale anytime soon. So again, I think for the people interested in making progress in this space, the problems at the edges are almost the most interesting ones, and I think there's progress on them, but we still have to see a lot for, say, stablecoins to become real payment networks at scale that everybody can use.
Maybe.
Well, if a platform is going to be used for payments, it's going to be subject to AML. It's just a fact that we have to deal with that. So even if it's not intended, but it effectively gets used for payments, it's still supposed to satisfy AML. So we really need to build things that with that in mind, and that's not a design principle that many proposals have used to this point. And I think certainly a CBDC system would have to satisfy AML. I think that's just a non-starter. Many other systems out there that are being proposed for payments from the private sector are still going to have to satisfy AML. So it's a major requirement, and it should be designed for from the start.
The one point that I was going to make is that we don't want to stifle innovation. So although we want to be able to create networks that will provide more security for transactions and payments, we also want to be able to have the ability for people to be able to experiment and innovate, and we don't want to completely close that door. And I do see a little bit of a risk by saying we need to enforce these kinds of things on some networks, because then you will stifle innovation, and there might be some things that won't be doable in the current regulatory space that actually maybe make sense for business in the future. We don't even know what those things are, because we're not even thinking in the same mindset as people might do in 20 years.
Sure, but it is very difficult to accept a certain amount of money laundering as a cost of...
Completely.
Yeah, as a cost, particularly if the benefits are things that we are not yet conceiving of. But yeah, certainly a big challenge for people to get around there. I wanted to, well, we've got the poll results now, actually, so maybe we can shoot that up and temporarily displace Christian. So 28% think the blockchain will form the basis of most of our payments within 10 years. So a fairly positive approach, and it's slightly over half saying it will be valuable in some payments use cases because of the governance models it enables, and another just under a quarter will be valuable for some payments use cases because of the settlement finality it enables. So generally speaking, a pretty pro-blockchain crowd here, which I guess is not a surprise, and only 5% think it's unlikely to form part of our payments landscape. So yeah, interesting. Maybe we can bring Christian back. Yes, there he is. Excellent. So. Scott, you talked a little bit about privacy enhancing techniques, and I think that's a big and important consideration for any blockchain payment system. It's come up a number of times already, the importance of privacy around CBDC, around payments. It's certainly something people care a lot about. The traditional design of a blockchain would expose, it's public, it's transparent, and people are generally able to see the holdings or the transactions of their counterparties. It's unlikely that, certainly for financial markets, that sort of information is market sensitive. We probably need some kind of opacity there. Is that something that is solvable in public networks? Is that something that needs to be done in private networks? Or what's your position on how we generate that? A little bit more privacy, but I guess still maintaining the oversight that regulators want to prevent crime and so on.
So I don't know if this is an open question.
Sure, yeah.
Maybe. So I think that a lot of this will be resolved by things like zero knowledge proofs and ZK rollups, like I said before. I also think that for a number of years, some of the private permission blockchain offerings have had very good solutions to this. Some of them, as you mentioned before, are not specifically very scalable. Others are kind of doing better in that respect. But I think that this will be completely doable. But the technology is really the deciding factor here.
But is that doable in private networks, or is that doable, because you mentioned
Oh no, in public networks
public
now
networks,
with zero knowledge proof
with the rollups and
and ZK rollups.
Yeah. Christian, your perspective on that?
Yes, no, I will echo that, and maybe even add that I don't only think that it will happen on public networks, but it will also happen on public networks without additional forms of trust, whether an additional sidechain or new forms of validators or a sequencer. I think you'll see all of this as some point-to-point solutions come to market. We're seeing it with a number of these layer 2 scaling solutions. And so I do think the privacy problem is also technically solved at this point. It's a lot more about, the other ones that we've already mentioned. Those are bigger problems that need to be solved for blockchain to be useful. But privacy, scaling, all of these are problems that, again, we were really worried about maybe 5 years ago, and now I think we have really good solutions for.
Anything else, Scott? Or, yeah.
I'm still a skeptic on that. I do believe that we have some solutions. They work in some use cases. Whether or not it's going to be, we have the best yet, or whether it's going to be a broad application, whether they're all compatible with each other. Again, when we come back to the interoperability issue, whether the privacy solution on your blockchain matches with the privacy solution on mine, and whether that really works, or we're somehow back to a greater coordination problem, where we not only have to have the underlying blockchain protocol talking to each other, but the privacy solution has to be compatible, and the governance solution has to be compatible. And there's a lot of coordination issues involved in all this. Governance is what it comes down to.
Yeah. I mean, governance. Sorry,
I was just going to say. I think the other thing to bear in mind is that there are some regulatory standards that make creation of global blockchain networks quite difficult. For example, you can't take data out of a particular country. If you use at least a traditional blockchain, or at least use a distributed ledger blockchain where data is replicated across all of the nodes in that blockchain, even if you are ciphering that data, or encrypting that data, deciphering it, you are still replicating that data across the world, right? So there are still, I think, some use cases where at least the traditional blockchain, the way that we think about it, not so much the bilateral blockchains like Corda, for example, but the traditional blockchains where we have a shared ledger, need to be carefully implemented. And I think the financial services institutions are actually very, very aware of this. So it's not really anything that people aren't doing, but just the way that blockchain works means that it can't necessarily fit those scenarios.
Yeah, I think frustration with data protection regulation in frustrating cross-border payments progress is certainly not unique to blockchain. That's something that I think is going to be a problem for a while. And I guess in a lot of ways in cross-border payments we're making progress, but not in that, because it's generally getting harder to send data across borders for regulatory reasons rather than technical ones, obviously.
There's
please.
There's another dimension that I think solves the privacy paradox in a different way, is that often we assume that everything needs to be on the blockchain, so on a layer 1. I think the reason why public chains will scale is that actually some critical information can be exchanged off-chain by the parties involved. In a classical example, think about a layer 2 solution like Lightning, which offers you full privacy, would be transfer of information on beneficiary for travel rule purposes. That does not need to travel on the blockchain or through even the Lightning node participants. It would travel, only from sender and receiver, very much like it's supposed to travel today. So as you start combining a blockchain ledger with off-chain data exchange and protocols, I think the spectrum and the design options become a lot more flexible than what we see today.
Excellent point, thank you. I think we should open up to the floor for some questions. If anybody's got any, I think we may also have some coming in, or well, yeah, if you're watching online and you have any questions, do send those in as well. Any questions from the audience, or shall I? Yeah, one over there, thank you. There's a mic, there you go.
I'm Lalit, from Tata Consultancy Services, TCS. Question I have is, without regulatory support, would there be, a revolution in payments using blockchain? Because obviously, European industry, banking industry, spend billions on PSD2 compliance, which delivered sort of a basic functionality in payments as compared to what blockchain is trying to achieve. So what's the view on that?
So do we need regulatory support for that? Any thoughts?
I think that comes down to what you really mean by regulatory support. There certainly needs to be regulatory clarity for AML, the clarity that AML rules will apply, that sort of thing. Whether or not, I don't think the government has to be very pro-blockchain in order for it to prove its use case. I don't think it needs that level of support. I think if there is the use case there, then it can stand on its own. But there certainly needs to be regulatory clarity. What rules still apply? Is there any change in the rules that is required? Some countries have introduced regulations for blockchain. Canada hasn't. It's not clear to me that it really depends on the local circumstances. Whether or not the regulations are already principles-based, that they apply to the activity as opposed to the platform. So there certainly needs to be a lot of clarity that's added to them.
Yeah, it's a difficult balance to, in a sense, you want to be tech agnostic with the regulation, but yeah.
So maybe my take on this. So we've worked with a lot of regulators, kind of hand in hand to be able to, I don't know, for example, we worked on one of the first institutional crypto asset marketplaces here in the UK, one of the first ones in Switzerland, so FINMA, the FCA were very involved in all of those. And it was very much hand in hand developing and working with them back and forth for a long time, right? I think that process is, it's very heavy-handed, and there needs to be something which is just, that process is okay for these first lighthouse projects, but after that, you need to kind of put that into some kind of legislation, right? And I don't think we're necessarily good enough at taking these first projects and then moving that on into, because it just takes time. It takes a long time to get from that. And I also see that we've also been involved in some of the sandboxes, so Spain and here, right? And again, I see that, especially here, that in the regulatory sandbox, there's been a lot of crypto stuff that's been done for a long, long time, but the legislation is not quite there yet, which, I mean, I know these things take a long time, but I would say that we need to also try and push forward with that if we want to achieve what the government wants to achieve at this point in time of being very progressive, right, in these things.
Anything to add, Christian?
I would say that, first of all, the technology will progress, and I think we're seeing kind of organic adoption in usage across regions of the globe of some of these networks, because they actually solve problems for some people. And so regulation in some cases will have just to adapt to new use cases. Where regulation is already in place from traditional networks, I think players will have to kind of figure out what's the right technology to comply. And so if it's same risk, same regulation, I think there's ways to close the gap. I'm actually optimistic that there's new technology, and we've seen a massive jump forward with AI. When it comes to AML, I think the way it's done today, it's going to look very, very different, and public networks and blockchain will only improve that. So I don't see the two as kind of contradicting each other. I think regulation will come as use cases become more useful and as people want to use the technology for something. We're coming out again from years of speculation where when regulators look at that, I think it's hard to find, okay, but what are we trying to regulate? What is the public externality that we're trying to take account of, and what are the risk and market failures we're trying to stop?
That's the risk about regulation. It's hard to know about an innovative thing that we don't really know about, what the regulation is required to support, and what the regulation is required to control. So it would be very easy to go too far and kill the innovation.
Yeah. I might also add that I am totally pro-regulation. and the other thing is that in my time since I started looking into DLT and digital assets, so about 8 years now, we've gone from regulators being general innovation regulators to being complete specialists in DLT and crypto and having at least 1 or 2 people on their team, if not more, in certain jurisdictions like Singapore and Switzerland, who are working on this area. So I think they are working in the right direction and they've got the right ideas, but it'd be nice to see it a little bit quicker.
We've got a question from the virtual audience here from Susan Anthony at Rapid Procurement Incorporated. This is for Scott. What are the plans for addressing the volatility and price fluctuations of cryptocurrencies native to the selected public blockchains that will be used within the Canadian financial infrastructure?
None. Again, back to what we were just talking about, and the purpose of regulation. It's not the purpose of regulation in the traditional space to regulate prices of assets or currencies. We don't regulate the foreign exchange prices that way. We don't regulate stock prices, bond prices, and anything like that are regulated. The markets, the fair trading rules in the markets, those are regulated. Yeah. But the prices are not regulated. They're market determined. We believe in the power of the market for the most part, once everybody follows the rules, that's the best force for determining what the appropriate prices are. Yeah. So we need to be sure we're controlling fraud. We need to ensure we're controlling money laundering and that sort of thing. But after that, and you have a fair set of rules for the players, the market's supposed to, and supply and demand is supposed to determine what the price is.
I guess you might consider, though, regulating access to that. I mean, not everyone can buy all types of financial products, even if the price is market determined, but that might be difficult in a blockchain context where access is pretty hard to control.
Yeah. So yeah, again, it'll depend on what we're talking about here. Is it pure payment or is it a financial asset? And there's rules in Canada and other places about who can buy certain assets. Are they only institutional assets or accredited investors, or are they retail level assets? And I think those are appropriate rules. And there's certain application of those to crypto assets, but again, it'll really depend on what the asset is. Yeah. To make sure that we've applied the appropriate rules that to ensure that there's fair and informed access to those products. Yeah, yeah.
Any questions from the audience? Or? Yeah, one over here. Thank you. I'm going to make sure I keep answering questions on opposite sides of the room to get everyone a run.
Thanks for this great discussion. Jose Marquez from Bank of Spain. I agree with the point on regulation, but I have a concern that maybe we can create a dual war in this sense. That is, I understand that in the retail space there are a lot of things like AML, privacy, and so on that are difficult to tackle, and then it's difficult to take into account in some recognition of this kind of transactions through DLT. But on the wholesale sphere, where these concerns are not so important or so critical, we are developing in some areas, like in Europe with the DLT pilot regime, or in UK with the infrastructure regime, the possibility to recognize this DLT to do payments in the wholesale sphere. Then I not see what will be the consequences of having one part of the payment system where we can use this one, and another one where, because of this AML and so on, we are not using this one. Then I not see what are the consequences, but we'd like to know what's your opinion on that.
Yeah, again, I think we apply the technology to the use case where it's most appropriate. And we think seriously about interoperability issues. We want money to be able to flow freely from one use case to the next. We don't want walled gardens. We don't want fragmentation of liquidity. We don't want various entities exploiting market power, monopoly power. So as long as those things are considered in the design, then fine, apply the best technology to each use case. That's really hard to do because you're trying to balance a lot of different incentives there. And the other problem is that it's quite often the regulator or the policy entity that is trying to act as a social planner and balance all of these different objectives. And it's not the individual entity that's proposing a solution for a particular market that is concerned about those things. So there's different incentives there, and it's not clear that the first solution is the socially optimal solution.
Anything to add on that?
Not really. I think that would pretty much sum it up from my perspective as well. But I think we will have probably some separation of things that are inside the KYC AML world and things that are outside of the KYC AML world, and we'll probably have things which are on chain and things which are off chain, which I think was mentioned before, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, multiple solutions, I guess. Any other questions from the audience? Or shall I have? No. No, I don't think so. So I was going to ask a little bit about, just on returning to the question of KYC and, in a peer-to-peer context, how do you cover this? And I wanted to ask a little bit about the travel rule, the FATF's travel rule for this. So I was wondering, Christian, can you talk a little bit about the travel rule as a means of kind of addressing that challenge, and what are the problems with enforcement? And I know it's differently applied in different places, but yeah, I'd be interested to get your perspective on that.
Yes, again, I think there's a lot of good ideas in this space and how to implement functionality that we have from traditional payment rails. So I don't think that is the hard part. The piece that is missing is the identity one that we were talking about a little while ago. And on the identity part, I think we're seeing really interesting progress on things like verifiable credentials and other approaches to decentralized identity, where you will suddenly see, and we've seen experimentation on large platforms like LinkedIn and others, where suddenly you can start connecting different pieces of your identity across public and private services. I think once we have that and you have good privacy solution, people will be able to attest that they're transacting, whether it's from a non-custodial wallet or a custodial one. I think that distinction will become a lot more blurry. And as long as you have KYC plus a non-custodial wallet, I think you can replicate a lot of the functionality of the existing system.
Just because it's related, we've got an audience question here from Talha Khan at IBM. And I think, you've alluded to identity already, which I think is going to be part of your answer here. But what do you think is necessary for public blockchain/L2s to become as scalable and as regulatorily compliant to match private blockchains and be better than them for day-to-day worldwide payments?
I think there are players today that are already using them in a compliant way. So there's definitely a path for doing that. I think if you go from kind of VASP to VASP, or between different exchanges or crypto wallets or digital wallets, to a much more open architecture, there's bigger questions that need to be solved. Namely, how do you treat a non-custodial wallet that is not attached to a VASP? I think we'll see innovation in that too. And again, I'm really confident that given everything that people are experimenting, eventually we'll land on a solution that I think the public sector and everyone will be comfortable with.
I think also you have to think about the way that you are planning your payment system as well. So you have to take into consideration how you're managing user data. You could use verifiable credentials, for example, without necessarily putting that on chain as well if you wanted to. I mean, that's just a W3C standard, right? So you don't necessarily have to integrate that with the actual payment itself, have everything on chain, therefore have GDPR problems. So there's a lot of different ways in which you could approach your payment system, but you need to take the whole picture into view, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got another question just come in. This is from Ravi Sarathi from Northeastern University. Are network effects likely to result in oligopolies of blockchain-based payments providers? Which, those were fears that were part of the problem with the Libra and DM situation. And would that be an issue? Is that something that you're concerned about?
Well, everything about payments is about network effects. So yes, that is a concern. So we have to think about whether the growth of one network provides a market power to an entity that's being abused. So we don't want walled gardens, as we've said. We want interoperability and interlinking between systems. So it's something we definitely need to be aware of. I can't say now ahead of time what the solution is, but we want competition. We want money to flow freely. There's different ways to get to that point, whether that means that there's one technology. Well, you have to separate the technology conforming or whether or not there's one entity in control.
Which may not be the case if we're looking at decentralized, Christian, you might have an interesting perspective on that one, obviously.
Yes, of course. And I think that's exactly why you heard me emphasize the public open permissionless networks. I think at the end of it, and the problem with many of these additional layer ones is there's a startup behind it, there's a team. No matter how much you put efforts into decentralizing governance, like we did, with 2,000 members with equal voting power, you're never going to get there. And so to some extent, that's why I'm actually very confident that at least the leading blockchain networks like Bitcoin and Ethereum will play a major role. I think that's where we will see the activity also in payments. And for the exact reasons of if you're moving from that construct to something that reintroduces trust, then you're somewhere in between, right? You don't have the benefits of fully decentralized model and you don't have the benefits of fully centralized one.
Absolutely. We've hit 3 o'clock, so this is a much longer discussion. I'm sure that we'll be able to continue at a later date, but I think we'll have to wind things up there. But thank you to my panelists. Thank you, David. Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Scott. It's been a fascinating discussion. I guess I'll just leave you with the thought that, we were talking about how important blockchain will be in 10 years, and I think people tend to overestimate the change that can happen in 1 year and underestimate what happens in 10. So I guess we'll see at OnFIF Symposium number, whatever we'll be at in 2033. So I look forward to seeing you there and hopefully before. We'll be joined after, I think we're going straight on with a presentation from Beshek Toprak, the Global Head of Coin Systems at Onyx at JP Morgan. Thanks to my panelists and welcome Beshek to the stage.